missing surveyors, a courthouse that burned to the ground twice in the same 40 years, and a single family portrait where the same four faces stare back at you across 9 decades, never aging, never blinking, never changing. The Lafourche clan built their whole reputation on things like that, out in the drowned country south of Thibodeau, where the paved roads give up and the black water takes over. For most of the last century, the people who went looking for that family did not come home the way they left. A few of them did not come home at all. Ask around the parish today, and half the old-timers will wave you off and tell you the Lafourches were nothing but poor swamp folk who kept to themselves and minded their traps. The other half go quiet the second you say the name out loud. But the land tells a different story than the people do. Because out in that marsh, there is a place where the ground rises for no reason anyone can explain, where a great curved shape of old dressed stone sits half swallowed in the mud, and where the parish census simply stopped counting in the year 1874 and did not start again for the better part of 30 years. This is the story of that family, that stone, and the 30 years somebody tried to erase. And I promise you, by the time we are finished, you are going to understand exactly why they tried. Now, before we go any deeper into that water, do one thing for me. If you are the kind of person who watches the surface of a still pond a little too long, wondering what is underneath it, then hit the subscribe button right now. This channel goes to the places the record books got scrubbed clean of, the towns that were quietly unbuilt, the names that were struck from the ledger with a wet thumb. The Lafourche story is one of the ones they buried the deepest. So subscribe, stay with me, and let's walk into the Bayou together. To understand the Lafourche, you first have to understand the country that made them, because that country is not like anywhere else on earth. Bayou Lafourche runs for over 100 miles down the belly of southern Louisiana, a slow brown ribbon of water that the old French settlers called simply Lafourche, the fork, because it splits off from the Mississippi and wanders south toward the Gulf on its own crooked path. The land around it is barely land at all. It is a place that cannot decide whether it wants to be earth or ocean, so it settles for being both and neither. Cypress trees stand knee-deep in still water with their roots pushing up out of the muck like the fingers of something trying to climb out. Spanish moss hangs off every branch in grey curtains that swallow sound, so that a man calling for help 200 yards away might as well be calling from the bottom of a well. And the mud down there is not the honest brown dirt of a farm field. It is a deep, soft, grey mud, with no bottom that anyone has ever found, the kind that pulls the boots off your feet, and, if the stories are to be believed, has pulled a good deal more than boots down into it over the years. The people who settled that country were their own kind of hard. French Acadians driven down out of Canada, Spanish islanders shipped over and forgotten, free families of colour who came to the lower water precisely because it was the one place the wider world could not be bothered to follow them into. They learned the swamp the way you learn a language you were born speaking. They knew which channels closed and which opened, which islands were solid and which would swallow a boat, and above all they knew, the way you know not to put your hand in a fire, which stretches of that water you left alone. People who grew up on the bayou will tell you the land itself moves. Not in an earthquake, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, overnight. A channel that was open on Tuesday is choked with silt by Friday. An island that appeared on a survey in 1890 is simply gone by 1910, with no storm on record to explain where it went. The bayou keeps its own books, and it does not show them to anybody. Outsiders did not fare well down there, and they still do not. Every few years, even now, some hunter or fisherman goes into the lower marsh and does not come out on schedule, and the men who go looking for him will tell you the same thing their grandfathers told them, which is that the swamp does not so much take a man as quietly stop agreeing that he was ever in it. A channel he swore he came in through is simply not there when he turns to leave. The moss looks exactly the same in every direction he faces, and the compass, more often than it has any honest right to, begins to wander, the needle drifting and settling, and always, in the end, pointing back toward the same low place out in the marsh, no matter which way the man holding it turns himself to face. Somewhere in the lower stretch of that water, in the marsh between what is now Lafourche Parish and the wild edges of Barataria, there is a rise in the ground. On the survey maps of the 1830s it is marked, in a careful surveyor's hand, as an Indian mound, and then crossed out, and then marked again as unknown elevation, and then, on every map printed after about 1875, it is not marked at all. It simply vanishes from the record, the same way that whole 30 years of census vanishes, but the rise is still there. Anyone with a flat-bottom boat and a reason to go looking can find it if the water is low and the season is right. And what sits on top of that rise is the thing that started this entire investigation. It is stone. Curved, dressed, fitted stone. The kind of masonry that has no business existing in a swamp that was supposedly nothing but trappers' shacks and fishing camps until the 20th century. The exposed section is maybe 15 feet of a great arc, a piece of something that was clearly once much larger, sunk down into the mud at an angle, as if the whole structure had been pressed into the soft ground by an enormous weight from above. The blocks fit together without mortar. The joints are so tight you cannot slide a knife blade between them, and men who have tried have come away unsettled, because there is a kind of precision in that stonework that the eye reads as wrong before the mind can say why. The curve of it, if you follow the geometry out on paper, does not describe a wall. It describes a dome, not a small one. Something the size of a cathedral, almost entirely underground, with only the very top of one rib of it breaking the surface like the crown of a drowning man's head going under for the last time. The official explanation, on the rare occasions anyone in authority has bothered to give one, is that it is a natural rock formation. But there is no natural rock like that within 200 miles. Louisiana's Bayou country is sediment, silt, and clay. All the way down, thousands of feet of it, the slow gift of the Mississippi laid down grain by grain over 10,000 years. There is no bedrock near the surface. There is no quarry anywhere near. There is nowhere those dressed stones could have come from, no river that could have carried them, and no recorded labour that could have placed them. And no reason on this earth for a dome the size of a church to be buried under 20 feet of mud in a swamp that the history books insist was empty wilderness. Unless, of course, the history books are wrong about when that swamp was empty, and about who was there before, and about what happened to them. That is the possibility the Lafourche clan spent 4 generations making very sure nobody looked at too closely. Because the Lafourches did not just happen to live near that buried dome, they lived on it. Their cabins, their trapping camps, their whole scattered settlement sat directly on top of the rise, arranged in a loose ring around the exposed stone like a fence built to keep people out, or to keep something in. And for as far back as anyone can trace them, which is precisely the problem we are about to get into, keeping people away from that stone was the one thing the family did with total, unbroken consistency. They would trade, they would guide, they would sell you fish and moss and pelts, and even let you tie up your boat overnight at the edge of their ground. But if your boat drifted toward the rise, if your questions turned toward the stone, the whole family would go cold in a way that made grown men decide, very suddenly, that they had somewhere else to be. The first written record of the family that we can be sure about comes from the parish census of 1860. In it, a census taker named Edmund Aucoin lists a household on the lower bayou under the name Lafourche, which was strange in itself, because that is the name of the water and the parish, not a family. People down there took their names from saints and from France, from Boudreau and Hebert and Thibodeau and Guidry. Nobody took their name from the swamp itself. But there they are in Aucoin's careful handwriting. The head of household is listed only as J. Lafourche, age given as 40. Below him, a wife whose age Aucoin left blank, 4 children, and then a note in the margin that the man had no business writing on an official document, and that his supervisors should have struck out, but somehow never did. The note reads, in French, that the family would not say how long they had lived on the rise, and that an old woman among them, whom the others called Mère, claimed they had been there since before the water came. Since before the water came. In a place that has been under water, in one form or another, since long before the first human being ever laid eyes on it. Edmund Aucoin filed that census in the spring of 1860. By the winter of 1861 he was dead, and here is where the pattern that follows this family all the way to the present day makes its first appearance. Orcoin did not die of yellow fever, which took plenty of men down there. He did not drown, which took plenty more. According to the one surviving letter written by his brother, Edmund Orcoin walked back out into the marsh in December of that year, alone, against his family's begging, saying he wanted to finish the count properly, saying there were people on the rise the first survey had missed. He wanted to go back and count them. He never came out. His brother organized a search party of 12 men. They found his flat-bottom boat tied up neatly at the edge of the Lafourche settlement, his ledger book still sitting in it, dry, undamaged, not a drop of water on it. Every page was there, but the pages covering the households on the rise had been torn out, cleanly, right at the spine, by a hand that took its time. And no member of the Lafourche family, questioned over 3 separate days by 3 separate men, would admit that Edmund Orcoin had ever come back to the rise at all. That was the first of them. It was very far from the last. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what the Lafourche clan spent 4 generations keeping under the mud, the exact bend of the lower Bayou where the ground still rises, the survey coordinates the state-ordered struck from the record, the names and dates of the 6 men who went in to map it and never filed a report. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Over the next 60 years, the lower Bayou developed a quiet reputation that never made it into any official history of the parish, but that every guide, trapper, and fisherman in the region understood without having to be told. You did not go to the rise. You could work the water all around it. You could run your traps within sight of the exposed stone, but you did not set foot on the Lafourche ground, and you did not ask the Lafourche family what was under it, and if you were smart, you did not spend the night close enough to hear what came out of that settlement after dark, because people did hear things. The accounts are remarkably consistent across decades and across people who had no way of comparing notes. A low sound, they said, not an animal, not the wind in the cypress. A deep, slow sound that seemed to come up through the water itself, through the hull of the boat, through the soles of the feet, felt in the chest more than heard in the ear, always well after midnight, always from the direction of the buried dome. Men who heard it once arranged the rest of their working lives to make sure they never heard it again. One account, better documented than most, because the man who gave it could read and write and left it in a letter, comes from a trapper named Ovide Cheremy, who in the winter of 1897 got caught by a fast fog on the lower water and, against everything he knew to be wise, tied up for the night within a stone's throw of the Lafourche ground rather than risk the channels blind. Cheremy wrote that the family found him before he had even finished securing his line, and that they did not threaten him, and that this was somehow far worse than if they had. An old man came down to the edge of the water in the dark, he wrote, and simply stood there, not speaking, until Cheremy understood that he was being watched over the way a shepherd watches a sheep that has wandered too near the lip of a cliff. The old man told him he could stay until the fog lifted. He told him he could sleep. And then he told him, in that old, soft French, that whatever he heard in the night, he was not, under any circumstances, to get out of the boat and walk toward it, not for any reason, not if it called him by his own Christian name. Cheremy heard it. Around the black middle of the night, that low sound came up through the hull of his boat, and he wrote that it was not frightening in the way he had braced himself for, which was the truly terrible part of it. It was inviting. It was warm. It felt, he wrote, like being a small child again and hearing your own mother moving about in the next room, that bone-deep certainty that if you would only get up and go to her, everything wrong in the whole world would be made right again. He gripped the sides of the boat until his hands cramped shut, and he did not get up. And in the grey of the morning the old man was still standing there at the edge of the water, in the very spot he had held all night, as though he had not once moved or slept, and he nodded to Cheremy a single time, and Ovide Cheremy untied his line and poled out of the lower marsh, and, by his own written word, never again in 40 more years of hard trapping went below a certain bend of that bayou. He ended his letter with a line that has stayed with everyone who has read it in the century since. He wrote that he did not believe the Lafourches had saved his life that night out of any kindness toward him. He wrote that he believed they had saved it the way a man hauls a drunk stranger back from the edge of an open well in the dark, not out of love for the stranger at all, but because he cannot stand the thought of hearing one more body go down into the black of it. In 1889, the Catholic diocese, troubled by reports that the family on the lower Bayou had never been baptized, and kept to something the local priests would only describe uneasily as older, sent a young Jesuit named Father Bertrand Ory down to the rise to make contact. Father Ory kept a journal. Part of it survives, because he mailed the first half of it back to his superior in New Orleans before he went out to the settlement for the last time. In those pages he describes the Lafourche with a kind of mounting unease that reads, even now, like a man talking himself out of what his own eyes are plainly telling him. He notes that the family was welcoming, almost gentle, and that this surprised him, given everything he had been warned of. He notes that the children were healthy and quick, and unafraid of a stranger, which he found unusual in such isolation. He describes meals shared, songs he did not recognize in a French older than any he had heard, a courtesy in the family that he called, in one line, the manners of people with a great deal of time, and then he notes the thing that clearly cost him his sleep, the thing he circles back to 3 times over as many pages, unable to let it go. The grandmother of the household, the woman the family called Mère, and treated with a deference that bordered on worship, was the same woman, feature for feature, as a figure in a daguerreotype the family kept nailed to the wall of the main cabin. A daguerreotype that, by its style, its plate, and its mounting, could not have been made any later than the 1840s, 40 years before Father Ory ever set foot on that rise. And the woman in that picture was already old. He wrote that he must be mistaken. He wrote that the resemblance was surely a mother and a daughter, or a grandmother and a granddaughter, the family features simply running strong down the line. He wrote all the reasonable things a reasonable man writes when he does not want to believe what is in front of him. And then the journal stops, because Father Bertrand Ory went back out to the rise to spend one last night with the family, to say a mass they had, to his open astonishment, requested of him, and he did not come back either. The diocese sent 2 more men after him. Those men returned with nothing. No body, no boat, no journal, and a strong recommendation, entered into the diocesan record and then quietly sealed, that the Church cease all further contact with the family on Bayou Lafourche and strike the settlement from its list of missions entirely, which the Church did. The rise disappears from Catholic records in 1891 as completely as it disappeared from the survey maps in 1875, erased a second time by a second institution for the same reason as the first. You start to see the shape of it now. Every institution that turned its attention to that stretch of water, the census, the Church, and soon the state itself, followed the exact same arc, without ever comparing notes with the one before it. Curiosity, contact, a disappearance, and then a decision, always made quietly, always made permanent, to strike the place from the record and pretend it was never there. It is almost as if the safest thing anyone could do, once they truly understood what they were dealing with, was to make certain the next generation would not even know to go looking, to erase the rise so thoroughly that the buried dome and the family guarding it could go on undisturbed, unrecorded, and unremembered. In 1904, the state of Louisiana commissioned a full drainage and survey project across the lower parishes, part of a wave of land reclamation that was chewing up swamp all over the Gulf South in those years, draining it, staking it, turning wilderness into deeds a man could buy. A survey crew of 6 men was assigned to map and stake the lower Lafourche marsh, including, whether they knew it or not when they signed on, the rise. Their names are worth saying out loud, because somebody went to a very great deal of trouble to make sure they would not be. The crew was led by a state surveyor named Alcide Tempelt, a serious, methodical man with 15 years in the field and no patience whatsoever for ghost stories. With him were his assistant, 2 rodmen, a cook, and a local guide hired out of Golden Meadow who, according to the one letter that survives from the expedition, tried to quit the job the moment he understood where Tempelt intended to take them. Tempelt did not let him quit. The crew went into the lower marsh in October of 1904. Tempelt filed field reports by mail every few days, as the state required of him, and those reports are the reason we know anything at all, because they were logged into the state record in Baton Rouge the day they arrived, before the crew ever reached the rise. And once a thing is written into that ledger, it is very hard to pull back out again. The reports start out perfectly ordinary: water levels, elevations, the usual field complaints about mosquitoes, about rot, about instruments fogging in the wet air. Then, in the fourth report, Templeton mentions the rise for the first time, and his handwriting, which had been neat and level and professional through 3 reports, begins to change. He describes the exposed stone. He describes measuring it and getting numbers that did not make sense to him, a curve too regular for anything natural, an angle repeated too precisely to be an accident. He describes the family, whom he calls civil but watchful, and notes, with a surveyor's dry understatement, that they seemed to know his business better than he had told them. And in his 5th report, the last one Alcide Templeton ever mailed to anyone, the methodical man with no patience for ghost stories writes a single line that his superiors underlined twice in the margin and then, for reasons of their own, never acted upon. He writes that the structure is not merely buried, he writes that it is sinking, slowly, measurably, in real time. Over the 11 days his crew had been camped beside it. The exposed stone had gone down another 4 inches into the mud, and he had the stake measurements to prove it. 4 inches, in 11 days, in ground that had not moved a hair in the years the state had records for. And something, he wrote in the very last line, something is still inside it. The 6th report never came. When the state finally sent men to find out what had become of the Templeton crew in the spring of 1905, they found the campsite standing exactly as it had been left, tents still up, instruments still in their cases, oiled against the damp, Templeton's field ledger lying open on a folding camp table, weighted against the wind with a stone, the last entry cut off in the middle of a sentence. And of the 6 men, not one. No sign of struggle, no sign of flight. 6 grown men gone out of a standing camp as if they had stepped out to check a line and simply kept walking down into the earth. The local guide from Golden Meadow, the one who had tried to quit, turned up alive 8 months later in a charity hospital in New Orleans, unable to say his own name, unable to sleep more than an hour without waking the whole ward with his screaming, and unable, or unwilling, ever to say one single word about what he had seen in the lower marsh. He lived another 40 years in that condition, and he died in it. The state closed the survey. It reclassified the entire lower Lafourche marsh as unsuitable for development, and, as you have already guessed, it removed the rise from the project maps, erased again. The 4th time in 50 years that an arm of the modern world reached toward that stone and then pulled back its hand and pretended the stone was never there. Now, here is the part I promised you at the very start, and it is the part where this stops being a story about a strange, unfriendly family and becomes something a great deal harder to wave away. I told you about a portrait in which the same 4 faces appear across 90 years, never aging. I need to tell you now where that portrait comes from and what the census sheets, the ones the State Archive swears were destroyed in a flood, actually show when you lay them out on a table next to one another. Between 1860 and 1950, the Lafourche household appears in official records exactly 4 times. The 1860 census, which we have already discussed. A 1900 census, taken by a man who very clearly did not want to be there and got himself in and out again as fast as his boat would carry him. A single land assessment in 1921, filed by a clerk who never went in person and worked off older paper. And a photographic survey in 1938, when a government photographer working his way through the Bayou to document rural poverty took, without any idea of what he was actually looking at, the clearest images of the family that exist anywhere. 4 records, spread across 90 years. And in all 4 of them, the same handful of first names appear at the head of the household and among the children. Not similar names, not family names lovingly passed down the generations, which would be ordinary and expected. The same names, in the same order, born by people at ages that do not move the way the ages of human beings are supposed to move. In 1860, the household head is J. Lafourche, age 40. His wife, age left blank. 4 children, listed by name. In 1900, 40 full years later, The household head is listed once again as J. Lafourche and the census taker, a different man entirely, a stranger with no knowledge of the 1,860 sheet and no reason on earth to lie about it, writes his age as 45. 40 years pass on the calendar, and the man ages 5. His wife, again, age refused, the census taker noting in visible frustration that the woman would not give him a number, and that the whole family seemed to find the question quietly funny, as though he had asked the tide how old it was. And the 4 children, still 4, still there, bearing the same 4 names they bore in 1860, and yet, if you take the record at its word, they would by then be older than their own father. Then the photograph. In 1938, the government man photographs the family standing in a row in front of their main cabin, in the hard, flat light of a Louisiana morning, moss hanging still behind them. And when you place that photograph on the table next to the daguerreotype Father Horry described in 1889, the one that could not have been made any later than the 1840s, you are looking at the same faces, the same grandmother, Mère, already old when the daguerreotype was struck, and no older, not by a single line, a full century on. The same J. Lafourche. The same 4 children, still unlined, still smooth of face, staring into the camera with the flat, patient, unbothered calm of people who have watched a very great many photographers come and go over the years and understand perfectly well that they will outlast this one too, the way they outlasted all the others. 4 faces. 90 years at the least, and in truth a great deal more, and not one of them aging a day. And in the corner of that 1,938 photograph, just visible past the edge of the sagging cabin, the top of the buried dome, breaking the mud, exactly where it has always been, except that in the 1938 image, measured against the 1,904 survey sketches by anyone who cares to lay a ruler across both, it is lower. It has gone down another 2 feet. It is still sinking. And whatever the Lafourche family truly is, whatever it is that lets them stand in the same unchanging bodies across a century while the rest of us go grey and bend and return to dust, the whole weight of the evidence says they did not get it from a church, and they did not get it from the earth, and they did not get it from any medicine or any bloodline known to the world. They got it from the thing in the dome, and the price of it was standing guard over that thing, on that rise, in that mud, generation after ageless generation, so that it could go on sinking down to wherever it was bound, and carry whatever it was carrying down there with it. Before we move on to the night, the whole bayou changed. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the 4 faces that never aged across 90 years of photographs is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original census sheets the archive says were destroyed. The missing 30 years, the 4 names that repeat, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now let me tell you about the night everything on that stretch of water changed, because it is the closest we can get to understanding what the dome actually is, and what the Lafourche family has spent all of this time holding down under the mud. The old people on Bayou Lafourche, the ones who are gone now and cannot be asked again, used to talk about the mud year. They did not agree on the exact date, which is itself a clue worth sitting with, because a real hurricane leaves a date every soul in the parish remembers to the day for the rest of their lives. But they placed it somewhere in the early 1870s, right in the raw heart of that 30-year hole in the census, the gap that opens in 1874 and does not close again until the century turns. And what they described was not a storm. There was no wind, they all agreed on that, no rain, no warning of any kind. One night, along the whole lower bayou, the water simply pulled back. It drew down and away from the banks like a breath being slowly taken in, exposing black mud that had not seen open air in living memory. And it held there, pulled back for the length of one long, silent night. And in that night, the land moved. Not shaking, sliding, whole banks of it, tons upon tons of grey mud, sliding down toward the rise from every direction at once, without a sound anyone could later describe, as if the ground for miles in every direction had tilted a single fraction of 1 degree toward that one point on the map, and everything loose had begun, patiently, to run downhill toward it. By morning the water had come back calm and brown and ordinary as it ever was, and the bayou looked almost the same. Almost. 2 settlements that had been on the maps the week before were simply gone, buried to the rooflines in fresh grey mud, the tops of their chimneys sticking up out of the muck like grave markers. An entire community of people, French and free, and living on the lower bayou for 3 generations, was not there anymore, and there is no record of a single one of them ever being seen again, and nobody counted them. Nobody wrote their names in a ledger and marked them lost, because that, precisely that, is the year the census stopped counting and stayed stopped for 30 years. There is one more thing about the mud year that the old people always lowered their voices to tell, on the rare nights they told it at all. They said that the 2 settlements which went under were not chosen at random by the sliding earth. They said that in the weeks before that silent night, the people of those 2 communities had begun, a few at a time, to go out to the rise. That something out there had started calling them the very way that Sound called Cherami in his boat, and that unlike Cherami, they had gotten up and gone. Whole families walking out across the marsh in the blue evening light toward the low place, and not coming back, and the neighbours left behind too frightened to follow them and too ashamed to speak of it in the daylight. And when the grey mud finally came down in the night and swallowed what was left of those 2 towns, there was a feeling among the survivors farther up the bayou, a feeling never once written down, only ever passed from one mouth to one ear, that the mud had not destroyed those settlements at all, that it had covered them, the way you draw a sheet up over something in a bed that you can no longer stand to look at. Every person who could have told us first-hand went down into the mud, or into the ground, or into that long, careful silence the parish keeps folded around its lower water. All that remains is the hole in the census, and the 2 chimney tops standing up out of the muck like markers, and the certainty, shared by every soul who has ever truly looked at it, that whatever happened in the mud year happened around that rise, and happened because of it. If you have spent any real time looking into the strange, quiet gaps in our own recent history, you already know this pattern, because it does not appear on only one bend of one bayou in one corner of Louisiana. It is everywhere, once your eyes adjust to it. All over the world there are cities with a foot, or a floor, or an entire story of their oldest buildings buried beneath the current level of the street, grand front doors that now open below the sidewalk, so that you step down to reach them. Tall, arched windows that sit half sunk into the ground, their lower halves swallowed, lighting cellars that were plainly built to be living rooms, ground floors demoted to basements. Whole ornate structures that the official story credits to plain pioneers with plain hand tools, sitting squarely on top of older, finer, buried work that nobody in authority can quite explain, all of it packed and filled with the same fine grey sediment, as though a single slow wave of mud rolled across the whole world at some point in the 19th century, and the history books simply closed over the top of it like still water closing over a dropped stone. The people who have noticed this and refuse to look away from it call it the mud flood, and in most places all you are ever left with is the buried floor and the sediment and the questions nobody official will answer. Go and look, once you know to look, and you will find you cannot stop seeing it. The old military forts shaped like perfect 8-pointed stars, laid out with a geometric precision that the ragged colonial armies credited with raising them could barely have surveyed, let alone built. Forts that turn up on nearly every continent looking as though they were all stamped from the same die by the same missing hand. The grand exposition halls and white palaces, thrown up in a single year for a World's Fair by cities that supposedly still had mud in their streets, and then, we are calmly assured, torn right back down again. The cathedrals that took, by the official telling, a couple of decades and a few thousand men with rope and timber, standing on foundations that no modern crew could match today. And underneath so many of the old downtowns of the world, block after block of buried storefronts and sunken sidewalks and bricked-over lower windows, whole ground floors of the past quietly demoted to cellars and packed solid to the ceiling with that same fine, sterile, sourceless grey silt. None of it, taken one building at a time, proves a single thing, and that is exactly how it has stayed hidden in plain sight for so long. It is only when you lay them all down together on one table, the way Dell laid the census sheets down on one table, that the pattern lifts up off the paper and turns and looks back at you. And nowhere on that whole table does the pattern look back harder or colder than it does from one low rise in a Louisiana marsh where the buried thing was never torn down and never bricked over and never filled in and forgotten, because a family stayed on top of it, in the same bodies, for 100 years and more, to keep the record from ever quite being closed. What makes the lower Lafourche marsh different, what may make it the single most important site of its kind anywhere on the continent, is that here the thing under the mud is still there, still whole, still intact, still by every measurement we have across 160 years, sinking. And here, alone of all the buried places, a family stayed behind on top of it. A family that does not age, standing watch over a dome that will not stop going down. So the question becomes the only question that has ever really mattered in this whole story. What is inside that dome? And here I have to be honest with you about where the hard record ends and where we are left to reason from the shape of the hole in it, because no one living has gone inside that structure and come back able to tell us. The men who got close either vanished off the face of the earth, like Aucoin, like Eerie, like Templeton and his crew, or they came back hollowed out and howling, like the guide from Golden Meadow who screamed in a New Orleans ward for 40 years and took whatever he saw down into the grave with him rather than shape it into a single word. But we can reason from what surrounds it. We can reason from a family that does not age, from ground that drags itself downhill toward a single fixed point, from a structure that sinks on its own steady schedule while everything around it holds perfectly still, from a low sound that rises up through the water after midnight and is felt in the chest of every man unlucky enough to be near, and from 30 years of missing census, a church that sealed its own records and fled, and a state that wrote off an entire marsh as worthless rather than send one more crew into it. There are two ways to read the Lafourche family, and I will tell you plainly that I have gone back and forth between them for longer than I am comfortable admitting. The first way is that they are the wreckers, that when the old world, whatever it was, whoever built in dressed and mortarless stone in a swamp 10,000 years too early for it, went down under the mud in a single night, this family were the ones who stayed behind on the ruin to pick it clean and feed off what leaked out of it, that they trade their years and their aging away, decade after decade, for the power that seeps up out of the buried dome, and that they keep every other living soul away from the stone, not to protect any of us, but to keep the source of that power to themselves alone. Under this reading, the Lafourches are exactly what the title of this video calls them, the swamp's most wicked family, a single bloodline of scavengers grown ageless and strange, and patient on something they were never meant to touch. And there is a great deal in the record to hang that reading on, from the disappearances, to the census pages cut cleanly from the spine by a hand in no hurry, to the cold that came over the whole family the instant a stranger's boat drifted a few feet too near the stone. But there is a second way to read all of it, and I will tell you that the longer I sit with the whole of the evidence, the more I have come to believe it is the true one. Under the second reading, the Lafourche family are not the wreckers of that buried world. They are its wardens. Somebody has to stay on the rise. Somebody has to keep the living away from a thing that ruins everyone who reaches it. Under this reading, every man who vanished on that rise did not vanish because the Lafourches were cruel to him. He vanished because he got too close to the dome, and the family could not save him from what waits inside it, and could do nothing afterward but make sure his boat was found tied and dry, his ledger returned, and his story struck from every record so that nobody else would be tempted to follow him down. The coldness in them was never menace. It was the settled face of people who have watched more strangers than they can count walk, smiling and curious, toward the one door in all the world they cannot allow anyone alive to open. There was one man before Dell who is worth telling you about, purely because of how completely he was taken back out of the world. In the summer of 1957, a newspaper man out of New Orleans named Raymond Saunier drove down to the lower parish, chasing what he was sure would be a colourful little feature about a hermit family in the swamp who supposedly never grew. Old? The exact kind of harmless tall tale a Sunday edition runs to fill the space between the advertisements. Saunier was a serious reporter slumming on a soft assignment, and he made the one mistake that serious men always make with this particular story, which is that he began to actually check it. He found the 1,900 census before it went missing. He found people still living in Golden Meadow who remembered, as children, the autumn. The survey crew went into the lower marsh, and did not come back out. He filed 2 columns. The first ran, light and sceptical, gently poking fun at the old superstition for the amusement of his readers. He never filed the third. His own editor's note, buried in the newspaper's morgue and discovered many years later by Dell, says only that Sonia had taken leave to finish his research in the field, that he had not returned to his desk, and that the paper considered the matter closed. His byline never appeared again, not in that paper, not in any paper, not anywhere, ever. No record of a Raymond Sonia survives past the fall of 1957. No obituary, no grave, no forwarding address. And the 2 columns he did file were pulled from the paper's own bound volumes at some later, unrecorded date, cut cleanly out of the pages with a razor, leaving 2 neat rectangular holes in the archive, where a reporter had once told the parish a little of the truth about its own lower water. Dell found those 2 holes before he ever found anything else. He said, near the end, that they were the thing that first convinced him the whole story was real, not the presence of the evidence, the precise, deliberate, unhurried absence of it. A man does not go to the trouble of cutting 2 old columns out of a bound newspaper 20 years after they ran in order to hide a superstition. He does it to hide the fact that the superstition had been checked and confirmed by a professional whose entire trade was being hard to fool, a man who then walked into the lower marsh himself and became, like every one before him, one more clean rectangular hole where a living person used to be. Which brings us, finally, to the present, and to the man whose 11 years of work are the only reason I was able to piece any of this together for you at all. A researcher I am going to call only by his first name, because his family has asked me to, and because of exactly what happened to him. His name was Dell. Dell grew up in cut-off Louisiana, right on the Bayou, close enough to the lower water that he heard the mud-year stories from his own grandmother before she passed, told low and serious, the way you tell a child a thing that is meant to keep him alive. Dell spent the last 11 years of his life doing the one thing nobody before him had ever managed to do, which was to gather all of it, every scattered piece, into a single place. The census sheets, which he pulled from a state archive in Baton Rouge before, and I want you to hear this exactly, before those particular sheets were logged as destroyed in a flood that somehow damaged no other document on the same shelf, or the shelf above, or the shelf below. The Aucoin letter, bought at an estate sale from a family that had no idea what it was. The surviving pages of Father Ory's journal, which Dell found in a sealed diocesan box that a sympathetic old clerk, near the end of his own life and tired of keeping other men's secrets, quietly let him photograph one afternoon. The template field reports, copied by hand out of the state record before, you will not be surprised to learn that section of the record was quietly pulled for restoration and never returned to the shelf. The 1938 photograph laid down on a table beside the 1840s daguerreotype. Dell told the few of us he trusted that the deeper he dug, the more the sources themselves seemed to fight him. Not the people, but the paper itself, the records, the reels, the folders. A librarian would pull the very box he needed and find the folder inside it empty, though the index at the front swore the folder was full. A reel of microfilm would run clean and sharp on either side of the frames he wanted, and be fogged to a solid grey blur across exactly those. He learned to photograph everything the instant he laid eyes on it, to develop the film that same night, to mail copies to 3 separate addresses in 3 separate towns, because he had already learned the hard way that a document he had merely read and meant to come back for had a way of simply not being there the second time he went looking. He was not a superstitious man when he began this work. He said the swamp had not made him superstitious. The archives had. By the last year of his work he had stopped sleeping properly. His notes from that stretch, which I have in front of me, grow tighter and faster and begin to repeat themselves. The same 3 or 4 lines copied over and over in the margins, as though he were reminding himself of something he was terrified of forgetting, or terrified of being made to forget. He assembled it all, every last fragile piece of it, the way I have laid it out for you tonight. And then, against the plain advice of every single person who cared whether he lived, Dell did the one thing that I have not done and that I will not do. He went to the rise. Dell went into the lower marsh in the late autumn, when the water sits at its lowest and the most stone shows above the mud, with a boat, a camera, a notebook, and one partner who agreed to stay back with the boat while Dell walked up alone onto the Lafourche ground. That partner is the only reason we know how any of it ended. According to him, Dell was gone a little under 2 hours. The settlement, he said, looked long abandoned. The cabins sagging into themselves, the roofs fallen, the moss grown thick over everything. No smoke, no sound, no sign of a single living soul anywhere on the rise. And that fit perfectly, because by our own century, the four faces had stopped appearing in any record at all, as though the family had finally finished whatever long work they came there to do and gone down quietly into the mud along with the dome they guarded. The partner waited by the boat in the failing light. And in the very last of the day, Dell came walking back out of the ruined settlement toward the water, and the partner told me the strangest thing about it, the one detail that has kept me awake longer than any vanishing or any torn-out page in this entire story. He said Dell came back calm, not frightened, not hollowed out, not screaming the way the guide from Golden Meadow had screamed, just calm. He said Dell walked down to the boat and sat himself in it and looked out over the still brown water for a long while without saying anything at all, and then finally said, very quietly, that he had been wrong about the family the whole time, that they had never been keeping something in. He said Dell told him, in a low, even voice, that he understood now why they never once let anyone reach the dome, and that some doors in this world are held shut from the inside, on purpose, by people who volunteered for the job a very long time ago, a job that does not end and was never meant to. And then Dell asked, politely, to go home, and they went home. And within the month, Dell had gathered up all 11 years of his research and quietly handed it out to a small handful of people he trusted, myself among them, with almost no explanation. And then Dell was gone. Not vanished in the marsh. Understand. Nothing so simple as that. He simply left, told his family he was well, packed a small bag, and walked out of his own life without a backward look. They have heard from him twice in all the years since, both times by letter, both times with no return address written anywhere on the envelope, both times saying only that he was well, that he was exactly where he needed to be, that they were not to worry, and that under no circumstances should they come looking for him. Both of those letters were postmarked from a small town on the lower Bayou, and if you take the name of that town and you go and check it against the maps, against the old survey plats and the parish rolls, you will find that the town is not there, that it has not been there for a very long time, that it was one of the two settlements that went down under the grey mud to the roof lines in a single silent night in the mud year in 1874. So where does all of that leave us, sitting here now? The dome is still out there in the lower marsh, lower than it has ever been, still going down at its slow, patient, unhurried pace, and by the plain arithmetic of Dell's own measurements, drawn carefully off the survey sketches and the photographs across 160 years of sinking, it has perhaps one more generation left before the last rib of that exposed stone slips under the mud for good, and the rise seals itself over, and the lower Lafourche marsh becomes, at long last, exactly as empty and unremarkable and forgettable as the maps have been quietly insisting it was ever since 1875. And on the day that happens, whatever is inside that dome, whatever it was that pulled the land downhill and stopped the family's clocks and cost 6 surveyors and a priest and a census man their lives and hollowed out a guide into 40 years of screaming, will be gone, buried past any reaching, buried past any door, which may, in the end, be the entire point of it, which may be the exact job the Lafourche family took upon themselves before any of us were ever born, and have now very nearly finished, to lose it on purpose. To let the swamp do slowly, gently, and forever what a single wave of grey mud once did to a whole world in one night, and to stand watch over it, ageless and unmoving and patient beyond all human patience, until the danger is safely and finally drowned. I started all of this by telling you about missing surveyors, a courthouse that burned to the ground twice, and 4 faces that never aged. I can tell you now, with everything else laid out in front of you, why that courthouse burned, both times, in 1878 and again in 1911, taking with it in each fire every single land record for the entire lower parish. I can tell you it was not lightning either time, whatever the newspapers of the day were given to print. I can tell you it was the same old instinct that tore the pages from Orcoin's ledger and sealed the diocese's box and reclassified a living marsh as worthless dead ground. The instinct to erase, to burn the paper. To make certain the next generation coming up would not so much as know to look. And here is the part I want to leave sitting with you the longest, because it is the part that I myself cannot shake loose, no matter how I turn it over. Every single institution that ever tried to honestly record that place ended, without one of them intending to, by helping to hide it. The census erased it, the church erased it, the state erased it. The fires finished the work the census and the church and the state had started. It is very nearly as if the truth of that rise, once any man truly grasps the whole of it, reaches back into that man and quietly converts him, turns every honest investigator who gets close enough into one more warden. One more person making very sure, from then on, that the door stays shut. I have felt it myself, if I am going to be honest with you, in the making of this very thing, the pull to soften it, to add the word allegedly one more time than the evidence actually calls for, to frame the whole story as a fun little legend of the Bayou and wink at the camera at the end, so that nobody watching ever takes it seriously enough to go down there and check. It is the same instinct, arriving in me exactly the way it arrived in the census men, and in the priests, and in the state, and in poor Raymond Saunier before his 2 columns were razored out of the bound volumes. The instinct to help, to smooth the ground back over, to become one more quiet warden of the very door I have spent all this time trying to show you. And the only defense I have found against it is to do the precise opposite out loud, on purpose, in front of witnesses, which is what this is. You are the witnesses. That is not a figure of speech. Because here is the whole truth about a door that is held shut by everyone who ever gets close enough to see it. It only stays a secret for as long as no one but the wardens knows that it is there. The census men did not tell you. The church sealed its box and did not tell you. The state burned the courthouse to the ground rather than tell you. Saunier tried to tell you, and was cut clean out of his own newspaper for the trouble. Dell meant to tell you, and instead went down to the water to help hold the line himself. Every last one of them, when the moment came, chose the door over the truth. I am choosing you instead. And whatever that turns out to cost me down the road, I would far rather you know that there is a low rise out in a Louisiana marsh, with a dome of impossible stone beneath it, and an ageless family standing watch on top of it, sinking now by inches, than leave you comfortable and unknowing, the way the record itself has worked for 160 years to keep every last one of us. Dell understood something out on that rise in the last of the daylight, something that turned him, in the space of a single afternoon, from a man who had spent 11 years of his life trying to drag this into the light, into a man who mailed his life's work to a handful of strangers and then walked, calm and unafraid, into a town that does not exist, to take up a post and help hold a line. I have his research now. I have laid the whole of it in front of you tonight, every piece of it. And I will be honest with you, because you have earned honesty by staying with me this long. I have thought, more than once, sitting alone with those files late at night, about how very easy it would be to simply lose them, to let them slip out of the world, to quietly do my part. But I am not going to do that, because I think you deserve to know that there are places in this country where the ground itself keeps a secret, where a single family stood in the same bodies for a full century over a buried thing the history books wiped clean, and where the closer you come to the truth of it, the more the truth itself seems to want you to help it disappear. The Lafourche clan of the Louisiana Bayou were not, in the end, simply the swamp's most wicked family. They may have been its most faithful. Wardens of a door the rest of us were never meant to open, sinking now, at long last, down into the same patient grey mud that has been reaching up for it since before any of us drew breath. If this is the kind of history that the record books were built to bury, then it is exactly the kind we go looking for on this channel. And the next place we are going is farther north, up out of the swamp to a green valley where an entire town was declared drowned by a reservoir that the geologists quietly admit never held anywhere near enough water to cover it. That video is on your screen right now. Go and watch it, and keep watching the water, because the ground remembers what the books forgot, and every so often, if you are patient enough and quiet enough and willing to look, it gives a little of it back.